The key to getting a proper exposure is balancing aperture, shutter speed, and ISO settings. This is often called the exposure triangle, and it's absolutely essential to understanding how to get performance out of your camera. Once you've mastered the exposure triangle and all of its components, you can get the results you want. Noise-free photos, shallow depth of field, blurred motion. It all comes down to understanding how all three components come into play. But what is each component? A key adjustment that really changes how the lens performs is aperture, and it has several different implications on the shot. Aperture controls the diaphragm, which affects how much light comes into the camera. A smaller number means a larger aperture, which means more light. A higher number means a smaller aperture, which means less light coming in. It's typically represented with an F number, which is really a ratio. Each f-stop is going to represent a stop of light. And as you adjust the aperture, things inside the camera will change. Again, smaller number, bigger opening, more light, shallower depth of field. Bigger number, tinier opening, greater depth of field. This means that the area comprising what's in focus grows, but it's going to take longer shutter speeds or a higher sensitivity of the ISO to achieve a proper exposure. The next component is shutter speed. This controls how long the camera's shutter stays open. The shutter speed value also represents a stop of light. Shutter speed is typically measured in fractions of a second, although it is possible to actually have entire seconds of duration or many seconds for nighttime photography. The last option is the ISO sensitivity. This determines how your camera's sensor behaves. How much is it affected by light? The ISO number is similar to an older system, ASA, which was used to measure film speeds. ISO actually refers to the International Organization for Standardization, which is an international standard-setting body. ISO can be adjusted up or down. Each change is essentially representing a doubling or a halving of the sensor's sensitivity. To change ISO, press the ISO speed settings button, and then turn the command dial to a new ISO. It's important to control the ISO. A lower value is essential when shooting with an abundance of light. This can help ensure that your picture won't overexpose. If shooting in low light, you may need to use a higher ISO setting. The drawback, though, is that it can add digital noise to your photo. This is often possible to remove during editing on your computer, however. ISO is a very useful adjustment that modifies the sensitivity of your camera. As you increase ISO, you can use faster shutter speeds and smaller apertures. This is a typical adjustment when shooting in lower light. Higher ISOs can add some noise to the image, but give you the option of using a smaller aperture to capture deeper depth of field and faster shutter speeds to freeze the action. Now, when these three elements are combined, they'll represent a given exposure value, or EV. And essentially changing any one of these elements is going to have some very specific impact on the others. Let's have a look. I'm going to put the camera in manual mode. And right now, we're just slightly underexposed. But you'll notice that I'm at f4, which is all the way open for this particular lens. As I start to change the aperture value here and go to deeper depth of field, you'll notice that the shot gets significantly darker. I'm not just 2 stops underexposed. When the camera's meter is blinking, that often means that you are majorly underexposed. Let's go ahead and try to get focus here. Well, we're still quite a bit underexposed. However, I'm using a very short shutter speed here of an 800th of a second. And we're shooting a static object, so that's the easiest thing to change. Let's go ahead and slow down that shutter. Now, as we start to open that up to a longer shutter speed, all of a sudden we're properly exposed. But do keep in mind that the camera's sensor will often read a black background, like we have in this case, and try to force it to a neutral gray. So just because the camera thinks that it's properly exposed doesn't actually mean that it is. Instead, I'm going to look at my histograms there and lower this just a little bit. Now, that's looking pretty good, but the ISO is a little bit high for my taste. This particular camera is still quite effective at higher ISOs. The shot's still relatively clean. But that black backdrop is still a warm charcoal gray. So I'm going to tone that down a little bit by lowering the sensitivity of the camera sensor. Let's try there. Well, at this point, the noise is much lower, but the shot is a bit underexposed. Let's open up the aperture a little bit more to let in more light. There we go. That looks pretty good. I've got a warm but not pure black background. I've got a nice reasonable depth of field at f8 and a shutter speed that can easily freeze the action. Remember, all three of these properties are necessary to create a balanced exposure. It's really a three-legged table. You're going to want to look at each of these properties and find the balance. Changing aperture settings will affect the depth of field. Changing ISO will affect the sensitivity of light on the camera sensor, but can also introduce too much noise. And lastly, the shutter speed can be really critical to define if you're freezing the action or allowing motion to have a sense of energy or a bit of blur to it. All of these things need to be balanced if you're going to make a great image. One of the most useful shooting modes on your camera is Aperture Priority Mode. To use it, just turn the dial to the setting labeled A or AV for aperture value. Aperture Priority Mode is quite useful because you can use it to control the depth of field, how much of the image is in focus, and if a lot of the area can stay in focus or just part of the image. As you adjust the aperture, the other aspects of the exposure triangle, like ISO and shutter speed, automatically change to their correct values. I can also dial in an aperture to set the settings that I need for depth of field, and then let the camera do the rest. Typically, this is pretty easy to control. Just make sure that the mode dial is in Aperture Priority Mode. Then turn the command dials, usually the rear one, to adjust the aperture of the lens. Let me show you. In this case, let's go really shallow. This particular lens can be set to f4, and you'll notice that some of the focus is soft on the objects in the foreground. Let's set focus there. And now some of the chess pieces are sharp, but the ones on the far side of the board have gone soft. On the other hand, if we go to a smaller aperture, this particular lens maxes out at f22, although macro lenses can go even further. Now in this case, keep in mind that the shutter speed has changed as well as the ISO. I'm on auto ISO. There, at f22, the entire board was in focus. If we go into the middle there, part of the board is in focus while others are mostly in focus. And if we open all the way up on this lens, it becomes impossible to keep the entire playing field sharp. Now, I most typically use Aperture Priority Mode when I'm shooting my own photos because it gives me a lot of flexibility and control. I like it because it allows me to just quickly dial things in artistically. For example, when I'm shooting portraits, it'll allow me to set the blurriness level for the background. Using a larger aperture means that the background is going to be more defocused. Aperture Priority Mode can also be useful for things like landscapes, where you want a lot of depth of field, and you don't want things changing. With Aperture Priority Mode, you can choose any aperture that your lens supports using the command dial. Aperture is typically referred to as an F number. For example, f1.4, 2.8, 4, 5, 6, f8, f22. As you move from one f-stop to the next, it either doubles or halves the size of the opening in your lens. This means that more or less light gets through. One thing that can get confusing is that larger apertures get smaller f-stop numbers. But that's because this is really a ratio. What this is comparing is the amount of light entering the front of the lens versus what passes through to the camera's sensor. Larger apertures are used for two major reasons. The first is to let in more light. For example, when shooting the night sky, I'll use a larger aperture to properly expose for stars. When shooting a landscape or scenic photos, details are often important. In this case, aperture values near the middle range are more common. Here, you'll typically see things like f8 or f11, which can be useful to increase the area that is in focus, which in turn will show more details in the final photo. The smallest aperture, which uses a higher number, such as f22 on this lens, are far less commonly used. Images shot with these values can be prone to showing aberrations in the shot. However, you might need to use a smaller aperture to control the light when shooting under really bright conditions. Additionally, some users will shoot this way to really drag the shutter for shots where they want to see moving water or get the starburst effect on a light source. Aperture Priority Mode is a standard shooting mode for portrait and landscape shooters. Be sure to spend some time really trying it out. If you want to balance control over freezing action with ease of use, then Shutter Priority Mode is for you. This mode allows you to set the shutter speed, which controls how long the camera's shutter stays open. This affects how much light comes into the camera and can be useful for controlling the relative sharpness of moving subjects. This is useful when shooting sports and fast-moving subjects, and you need to control the freezing of the action. Or perhaps you want a slow shutter to smooth out a flowing waterfall or river. To shoot in Shutter Priority Mode, turn your shooting mode dial to S or TV for time value. Now, you can use the command dial to set the shutter speed for the camera, and your camera will calculate the right aperture and ISO settings. This is an easy mode to shoot with, but you'll need to make sure that your shutter speed matches your subject matter. We'll cover that more in just a second. Now, if you see a number on the camera, it's going to be displayed typically as a fraction. A value of 250 means 1/250th of a second. On the other hand, if you see a number followed by two lines or an inch mark, that usually means seconds. For example, 5 inch mark means 5 seconds. Remember, if you choose a shutter speed that's too fast or too slow for the current lighting conditions and ISO settings, the meter reading may flash. In this case, you'll need to adjust the shutter speed to achieve a balance or change the camera's ISO setting. Shutter Priority Mode is the right mode when you're dealing with moving subjects, particularly for things like shooting moving cars or flying birds. With these subjects, you'll need to shoot them with a very fast or short shutter speed in order to freeze the action. By shooting in Shutter Priority Mode, you can quickly dial in the right settings to freeze your subject's movements. Now, other times, of course, you might want to slow the shutter down. Slower shutter photography is often used creatively to capture a sense of movement and energy. Perhaps it's a moving dancer or the crashing flow of a waterfall turned into cotton candy as the ribbons of water flow by. I also love to slow the shutter down and paint with a moving light source. You may also find that Shutter Priority Mode is a useful mode for handheld shooting. You can force the camera to use a shorter shutter speed. This makes it easier to freeze the action. If you're going to take advantage of this mode, make sure you consider also using image stabilization or vibration reduction. This will allow the lens to really help you get the most out of the available light and to improve the shot overall. Now, choosing the right shutter speed is really subjective. Simply put, increasing the shutter speed stops or freezes movement. Decreasing the shutter speed blurs movement. Now, depending upon the size of your lens, if you're not going for a particular look, a shutter speed between an 80th and 125th of a second typically works well in most cases. The goal here is to be able to handhold the camera and not get soft focus. Now, if you can take advantage of other techniques such as your breathing and your grip, you might be able to shoot at slower shutter speeds. And this will typically work pretty well for average shooters using a normal lens. Remember, shutter speeds are measured in fractions of seconds or whole seconds. Typically, the fastest shutter is about 8,000th of a second, and many cameras can stay open for 30 seconds. Longer times are even possible with the use of a shutter release cable or a smartphone app. Shooting slower than a 60th of a second, though, may result in camera shake. In this case, a tripod is a very good idea. I use slower shutters to drag motion for things like moving lights and night sky, but I always recommend using a tripod with slower shutter work. Now, a value higher than 60, such as 1/25th of a second, 500th of a second, or 2,000th of a second, are considered fast shutter speeds. If you're shooting wildlife like a flying bird or action sports, it's not uncommon to use a very fast shutter. A value of 1/1600th of a second can be used to capture a slice of time that freezes the action. It also may be possible to use a shutter speed that is several full seconds long. Sometimes a photographer will put a neutral density filter or variable ND filter on the lens to lower the amount of light even more to slow down the exposure time. You see here we have a moving subject. Let's go with a fast shutter to really freeze the action. I'm set to auto ISO, so the camera automatically adjusts sensitivity. And you see there, at 320th of a second, the moving objects freeze in place. But if we slow that shutter down, let's go with a 50th. You see they're a little soft. Now, we'll go with an 1/8 of a second. And you see that the motion really becomes elongated. But you'll notice that the center poles are tack sharp. If we slow that down to a full second here and put them back into motion, now it becomes a complete blur. But again, the center poles are clearly in focus here because the camera is actually focused. It's just with a 1-second exposure, the moving object becomes quite streaky. And in this case, you may recall that objects on the outside do spin a greater distance than towards the center. This will lead to more blur on the outside edge. The exposure compensation command is very useful and very powerful. It's used when shooting in program mode, aperture priority mode, or shutter priority mode. It will likely become one of your most used options. It's useful when you're dealing with tough lighting situations that can throw off the camera's light meter, particularly things like light or dark backgrounds or very strong backlighting. This command is great for really controlling the tone of your photos. With exposure compensation, you can quickly adjust in fractional or whole stop increments. You'll find an exposure compensation button or perhaps a dial on your camera. You should be able to reach it without actually having to take your eye off the viewfinder. Now simply hold down the button and turn the command dial, or if you have a dedicated dial, turn that. When you do this, it will actually make positive or negative adjustments to the exposure. Each one of these little adjustments is going to typically be 1/3 of a stop. So plus 1/3, plus 2/3, plus 1 stop. You'll usually be able to make an adjustment up to 2 or 3 stops on the gauge. Dialing in positive exposure compensation makes a brighter image, while dialing in negative exposure compensation makes a darker image. Exposure compensation is useful for both program and priority modes. You cannot use exposure compensation in manual or auto modes. In this case, I have a mostly white background. And if I take the shot, and we take a look at the meters here, you'll see that everything has been pushed into the middle. That white backdrop is almost a middle gray. Well, let's turn up the exposure compensation. First, I'll add 1+ and take the shot. You'll notice that things get pushed over quite a bit. Now, let's add 2 stops. Now, the blinking there is simply a warning that I'm getting hot, but it's still not overexposed. Let's add 3 stops. In this case, the image is really quite bright. And you see that we have clipping. If using a mirrorless camera or some cameras with live view, it may be possible to see the exposure compensation in real time. You also can take a look at the histogram on back of your camera. If you're finding that the camera is underexposing important parts of a scene, try a positive value. This is great when you're photographing someone against a bright background where the brightness might cause the camera to underexpose the subject. A positive exposure compensation setting fixes that by increasing the exposure. On the other hand, if you find that the camera is overexposing a subject in a scene, try dialing in a negative value. If you need to dial in very precise settings, nothing beats manual mode. Now, it is a bit tricky, but manual mode gives you full control over both the shutter speed and aperture on your camera. That means that you can dial in the exact exposure that you want, but it also means that it's easier to under or overexpose if you're not confident with what you're doing. To switch to manual mode, just turn the dial to M. The last settings that you used will typically be shown in the camera. It remembers the previous manual settings. Now, the first thing I recommend is selecting the ISO that you want to use. Choosing an ISO setting that works well for the shooting environment. You can use a low ISO if shooting under daylight, or a higher number for low light shooting. Once the ISO is set, it's a good idea to measure the available light. To do this, press and hold the shutter button halfway. You can now tell how over or underexposed the shot is by looking at the camera's meter. If you don't have a meter, just take a test shot and look at the histogram panel. Now, it's time to adjust the aperture and shutter speed. Use the main command dial to change the shutter speed. Use the sub-command dial to change the aperture on your camera. As you learned earlier, aperture controls how big an opening the light has to enter into the camera. Shutter speed, on the other hand, controls how long the aperture stays open to let in more or less light. Both have creative and technical uses, as you've already learned. At this point, the camera meters that everything is properly exposed. However, the depth of field is a little shallow for this particular shooting situation. It looks to me like some of the dominoes on the far end are going soft. As such, I'm going to extend the depth of field. I'll get deeper depth of field by increasing the aperture. This particular lens goes up very high, all the way to f/36. That may cause some issues though, so I'm going to take it down. Do keep in mind that if looking through live view like we are here, you might not see the exact depth of field on a traditional DSLR. However, if we take a test shot, it will show us an accurate view of the depth of field. And in this case, we have a pretty good gauge. Now, the shot is reading just a little bit underexposed. I am shooting on a black background with bright white objects. Looking at my histogram there, it seems like the whites are popping closer to the midtones. Remember, during post-production though, it's easy to push the contrast. Let's open up this shot just a little bit. Looking at the exposure meter, we're very underexposed right now. Let's slow down the shutter and zero the meter back out. There. If we take a look at that shot, what happened here is that the camera read the scene and tried to meter to push everything to a neutral gray. In this case, the black areas are washed out, and the white areas have been maximized, however, look like they're clipping a little bit. As such, I'm going to ignore the meter's recommendation and underexpose by 1 stop. In this case, I'm going to leave the ISO alone. This is a good value for shooting in lower light here. But I'm going to turn this so we are about 1 stop underexposed. Here we're 1 1/3 stop. Let's take a test shot. That looks much more accurate to me. We have good detail in the blacks, plenty of coverage in the shadowy area, and during post-production, it would be very easy to increase the shadows. However, on the highlights, we have not clipped our whites. We have lots of detail there in the highlights, and it would be easy to make a contrast or clarity type adjustment during post-production. In this case, shooting manual allowed me to override the camera's settings, choosing to slightly underexpose on the meter due to the strong black background. Remember, manual mode doesn't unlock any secret powers. All it does is put you in total control over the aperture, the shutter speed, and the ISO, which really lets you override the automatic values that your camera tries to calculate. In general, make sure that the exposure lines up with 0. And according to your camera, this means a proper exposure. But remember, if you are shooting against a strong white or black background, you may have to manually under or overexpose. The same holds true if you're shooting into a backlit sky or trying to capture a nighttime shot. Remember, if the shot is to the right, it means that it's overexposing. This is going to allow more light in. If it's to the left, you might be underexposing. Sometimes as a photographer, you will choose to purposefully under or overexpose. This will allow you much better control. Sometimes I want to make sure that the clouds don't wash out, so I'll slightly underexpose. Perhaps I'm shooting the nighttime sky, and I'll play with underexposure versus overexposure to bring out more details in the stars. Remember, the flexibility of the RAW format means that it's quite easy to recover some of the additional details, pulling down the highlights even further or lifting up the shadows. If you find yourself doing some of the more advanced areas of photography, shooting manual is often very desired. For example, I often use it with panoramic shooting. This way, as I pan the camera left to right to capture the scene, nothing changes and it makes it easier when I composite all the images together. In order to get a proper exposure, your camera needs to accurately measure the light in the shot. This process is called metering, and most of the time, your camera will get it right. But you can switch metering modes in the camera to really help it out in trickier lighting situations. To change metering modes, use the menus in the camera until the desired setting is shown. The most common method is evaluative metering, which produces natural results in most situations. Some cameras may call this multi or matrix metering. Essentially, the camera divides the scene into a grid, and then it meters each grid and averages those values to come up with the overall exposure settings. Your camera considers the overall tonal distribution of the scene as well as composition. Now, with newer lenses, the camera can also analyze the distance as a factor. The camera decides the correct exposure automatically to match the scene. If the background is really bright, consider partial metering. This option may also be called center-weighted average metering. This method looks at the whole scene, but heavily favors the results from the center area. It's a zone at the center of the screen that's about 8% of the viewfinder. This really allows the subject of a photo to drive the exposure. This option is not available on all cameras. Remember, you can center the subject and half press the shutter button to meter. While still holding the button, you can pan or tilt to recompose the frame. This method is quite useful if you're shooting portraits and will really be useful if you've got a strong background or a very dark background. The spot option looks at a very small area, about 3.5 to 1.5% of the frame. This is really only useful if you want to be very specific on what's being used to set the exposure. For example, maybe something like product photography, where you have to be absolutely certain that the front of the object is driving the exposure. You can choose between different available options, and you should get familiar with each and occasionally test them out to see what works best for you.